Yes, welcome to the Africa Football Business Show. This is the second edition, quite exciting, on this 30th of July. Yes, this is a Thursday. So we have a special guest on the show. First, I'm Shon Osimbo, and I know we started this show 2 weeks ago, and it was amazing, especially the feedback. This is where we are creating conversations that will actually improve the football on the continent. And today we continue that discussion, and I'm very excited and very humbled actually to welcome this particular guest. That is David Goldblatt, all the way from the UK, one of the best authors. He understands football more than anyone, I believe more than anyone in the world. He's well known for his mostly his two major books. Let's just quickly take a look at them. First, The Ball is Round. I'm just trying to put that. Yes, The Ball is Round. And also we have The Age of Football. This is actually my favorite. So David Goldblatt, welcome to the show. Humbled to host you today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Lovely to
Yes.
be with you.
So awesome. I can't wait for the discussions just about football. It's so amazing how you actually understand African football, the research you've put into it. And I can't wait to share this with the whole world, with all the people who are watching. Please don't forget to leave your comments below. David will be able to answer them later on in the show. So quickly, David, for those who are not familiar with you or your work, who is David Goldblatt?
Well, I'm not the famous South African photographer, though I think I might be related many generations ago, as my grandfather was born in South Africa. About 20 years ago, I started writing about football, and in 2006, I published The Ball is Round, A Global History of Football, which was my attempt to understand the history of football as a game, but simultaneously as a political, cultural, and economic phenomenon. Along the way, I then published a history of contemporary English football called The Game of Our Lives, The Making and Meaning of English Football, and a history of Brazilian football called Futebol Nation. And then in 2019, I published a follow-up to The Ball is Round, which kind of finished the story around the turn of the 21st century. And I felt that so much had happened in global football in the last 20 years that it was time to catch up. So, it's volume 2, I suppose. My first love is Tottenham Hotspurs, inherited from my father and my grandfather. But I have to say, after 17 years living in Bristol, a small city in the west of England, I've lost my heart to Bristol Rovers, who play in League One, the third level of English football.
Yes, there's a Kenyan who just signed for them the other day. That is Jonah Ayunga, I believe, for Bristol Rovers. So maybe you should think about it. Yes. So let's your knowledge of global football is amazing, as I said, very, very top notch. What got you into being a football historian? Like, what made you? What was that ticked on your side and be like, okay, fine, I have to tell this story. I have to share all these behind the scenes stories to the world.
Well, a couple of things, I suppose. I was teaching at the Open University, which is the distance learning institution in the 1990s in Britain, as a politics lecturer, and watching a lot of football. And I looked around our department and I said, where are all the working class men? They're not coming to study with us. 75% of our students are women. What are they interested in? Football.
I
did a bit of reading. And I thought, didn't take long to work out there's an economics of football, a politics of football, a sociology of football, a psychology of football. And I thought, well, why don't we do a little starter course for people, advertise it in the sports press, come and study football and society. You like it, stay and do the whole degree. So I took this idea to the faculty and they weren't interested. So I was sort of left with this thing I'd sort of discovered. And I thought, what am I going to do with it? And I ended up making an encyclopedia. So my first football book was something called the World Football Yearbook, just before the internet really got going. And it was a 750-page graphic encyclopedia of maps, diagrams, and bar charts of global football. And it was kind of my apprenticeship, I suppose. And I published that in 2002. And I then I then left the Open University to be a freelance writer. And I'd spent the last 10 years before that studying globalization and global history. That was like the day job. And I just sort of, World Football Yearbook, globalization, put the two together, and you've got The Ball Is Round. And I was lucky enough to be able to sell it to Penguin. And 3 years later, The Ball Is Round was published. And what just overwhelmed me from the very beginning was the sense that everywhere you go, football means something pretty profound. It means different things in different places. It's expressed in different ways. Everywhere it is bound to cultural ideas, social groups, social and political action of every kind. And everywhere I looked, that's what I saw. And I sort of felt, impelled to collect it and communicate that idea.
Yes, and when you look at the number of pages on both books, this is just this first two, The Ball Is Round and The Age of Football. You can see how you give us everything. You don't want to leave anything behind. Yeah. So what exactly goes on into your mind before you take on, let's say, before you took on this assignment of Age of Football? Just process it for us. Take it through the process.
Well, what went through my mind was looking back at The Ball Is Round and realizing that although it was only published in 2006, finished writing it in 2005, it didn't mention Twitter. It didn't mention Facebook. In just 15 years, that's how much the world has changed. And of course, that's transformed the landscape of football, the meaning of celebrity, the way players and clubs communicate with their fans, etc., etc. And I look back at The Ball Is Round and I thought, at the turn of the 20th century, the three most populous nations on the earth are not really very interested in football. American football, men's anyway, is still in its infancy. China at the time, basketball would be the game of modern China. India, completely in love with cricket. And by 2016, 2017, all of that has changed. China, through Xi Jinping's 50-point plan, has committed itself to, becoming, one of the great football nations. In the United States, women's football is dominant in the world and men's football has grown hugely. And even in India, where cricket is still the number one sport, football is growing by leaps and bounds. The 2017 Men's Youth Cup, the under-17, the best attended Youth World Cup ever. Narendra Modi surgically attached to Twitter talking about football the whole way through it. So that seemed a really important transformation. And thirdly, I suppose, globalization in its modern form has been going since the 1980s, let's say. So by the time I was writing about it at the turn of the century, it was beginning to have an impact. But, another 20 years on, the economic and political globalization of football has transformed the landscape entirely. So for all of those reasons, it was like, right, got to go back to where we were, pick up the story and explain the sorts of transformations. I mean, even in the 20 years I've been writing about football, the game has always been popular, but now it is without question the most popular cultural phenomena in the world. Nothing is as global. Nothing has such an impact as football. And that seemed to me really urgent to be writing about.
Yes. And I remember listening to a podcast where you are featured and you're talking about understanding the world through its favorite sport. And as you say, football. So you've talked about China, you've talked about United States, you've talked about India. What exactly changed that they decided, let's also catch up on this sport that actually is, making an economical impact across the globe?
What an interesting question. I mean, I think different things are going on in different countries. So in the United States, for example, you've got the kind of finally the coming together of different strands of football culture. American football culture is very varied. You have the women's game with deep roots in college sport. and very deep roots in grassroots participation sport, where you have, more registered women players in the United States than the rest of the world put together. Then you have, more mainstream MLS, which has grown by leaps and bounds in the last 20 years. You have a huge constituency, mainly of white urban professionals who are engaged with European football and global football. It's all on NBC these days. And then you, of course, have Latinos in the United States, the fastest growing part of the population. And 40 years ago, sure, a lot of them were Cubans, and they were interested in baseball. But these days, Mexicans, Guatemalans, Hondurans, football is the game, and Latino football is huge. So all of those things have kind of come together in the United States, I would say. In India, I teach in a university in the United States sometimes, and I have a lot of Indian kids who come to my class, and they're studying I don't know, accountancy or chemical engineering, and they don't really like it. And what they really do like is football. And for these guys, it's like anyone can watch cricket now in India. Any untouchable, any peasant living in rural Bihar with a flat screen television has got access to cricket. So if you want a game that's going to kind of distinguish you from the rest of the country, then European football and the Premier League above all is the game that kind of does that. So I think that's brought a big change, changed the kind of status of football in India. And then in China, it's interesting. Partly it's down to Xi Jinping. He's clearly completely obsessed with football. Every time he goes around the world on a state visit for China, what happens? He gets given a football shirt of the nation. He comes to Britain. What's the most important thing? Gets the most coverage. Tea with the Queen at Buckingham Palace? No. Meeting Sergio Aguero at Manchester City's training ground. And I think he sees, in a global world where China is the rising power, you have to be dominant in the world's sport. And, Xi Jinping's 3 wishes, as they're called in Chinese politics, are that China should host the World Cup, qualify for the World Cup again, host the World Cup, and by 2050 win the World Cup. And I think, for him, it's like this, and this is official state policy. This is a measure of China's advance in the modern world. So different things going on, but all of them driven by the same extraordinary popularity that the game attracts.
Yes, and also talking about the game, I think we have now to bring it home. That is Africa, and I love how, and I told you this yesterday, I love how the first chapter of The Age of Football is definitely about African football. So much to learn. Some of the things I didn't even know, but through this book, I got to learn and understand the scope of football in Africa. Once again, when you're talking about United States, as much as they call it soccer, we have to convince them, David, to call it football. But I know because they have their own football, so the names will kind of clash. But football in the United States, football in China, football, in Asia, football in Africa has one common factor, and that is it's the sport that actually unifies the world. Sometimes, when the World Cup is going on and the whole world is at a standstill, everyone has forgotten if there were any wars, any, tribal wars, anything. They have forgotten all that conflict. They concentrate on supporting their national team. So let's bring it back home here in Africa. And most of it, we'll be talking about mostly the age of football. And 2010, where was I in 2010? I think I had just finished campus and I was transitioning into now working. And I remember the hype around the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. One of the best things to happen on the continent. I think the hype started like 5 years before the World Cup. And, just seeing South Africa putting up those amazing stadiums, renovating everything, the hype. Remember the Vuvuzela during that first match. It was very noisy and very loud. And we knew it's our time. Africa is here. Africa means business. But even according to your book, a few months later, it was a totally different story. So why do you think Africa has not delivered when it comes to the promise of the late 20th century, especially in the football world?
I mean, I think African football's journey in the last 20 years is, not dissimilar to the wider economy of the continent. It has been caught in a newly established network of global economic, migratory, and political interactions in which it has been structurally disadvantaged. And the two most important things that have happened to African football are the arrival of satellite television and the massive migration of players. So let's take satellite television. 2000, late 1990s, DSL and Canal Plus first arrive and start broadcasting European football. And, there's a long tradition, of course, particularly in Anglophone, but also in Lusophone countries of, engagement and interest and support in European football. But this takes it to a completely different level. And, by the mid 2000s, certainly by the late 2000s, African audiences for European football are absolutely huge. I mean, today, the Premier League, the official figure is 350 million Africans are watching every weekend.
Wow.
So that's like, my God, that's like half the adult population.
Yes.
And this has had profound consequences for the domestic game. People don't want to go. People have lost the habit of going to football. It's primarily a televisual experience. When they do go to football, none of the stars are playing in Africa for the most part, not even at the end of their careers. I mean, it's not even like Latin America where, I don't know, Carlos Tevez will go home and play a few seasons for Boca Juniors at the end of his career. No one's coming back. Didier Drogba's not coming back to play for ASEC, in Abidjan. And it is incredibly hard for African football to compete as a kind of televised spectacle. And we know, the figures are not always entirely accurate, but we know that the average attendance domestically is perhaps half of what it was 20 years ago. In Nigeria, when, stationery stores were playing, 80,000 people would show up, 10,000 away fans. This is not happening anymore. All over Africa, teams and clubs are rescheduling their games so that they're not playing at the same time as Arsenal and Chelsea. So you've had a collapse in the size of the crowd, a collapse in the media coverage, and alongside this huge exodus of players. I mean, Africa continues to produce absolutely piles of footballing talent, both men and women. But, there are 2,500 African professionals playing outside of Africa at the moment. And not just in the big leagues. People are playing in Kampuchea. People are playing in Myanmar. There are Cameroonians in Indonesia. And this is, a measure of how grim the situation is for many African footballers. We know from the FIFA Pro study that was done in 2016, most African footballers don't have a contract. They're not earning regular money. They're being played late. Conditions are not good. Why wouldn't you go and take a chance and go and play in Mumbai or, or in Jakarta? So if you put those two things together, Africa has been an exporter of, consumer demand and talent as the way it is in the rest of the global economy. And this has been disastrous for the home game. I mean, that's not to say that there are not problems with African football administration. That would have been a problem anyway. But when you add that to the extent of globalization, of labor markets and of fan support, it has been completely devastating. And I think it is it's a tragedy, is how I would describe it. And, worst of all, it's not even as if African clubs and African football is reaping much money from this, because so many players are developed inside private academies, and run by one-off agents, that you don't have a steady flow of money coming into the domestic game. I mean, at least Latin America is making some money. Africa is not making money out of this. So it has been a very, very difficult and rather dismal period for African football, because it's been so undermined by the presence of European football.
Yes, and just still on that note about European football, you've talked about, and it's very true. It's very true. Even if you come to Kenya, the two most supported teams in the English Premier League are Arsenal and Manchester United. There's also a song out, and especially when they're playing Katia Arsenal na Manu Gani Kali. That means between Arsenal and Manchester United, which is the top team, which is the better team. So that is actually what is happening on the continent. I'm looking for a part in your book, and I'll just be coming to that, where you're even talking about how this has taken root into definitely our even politics on the other side, where William Ruto was compared to Leicester City. Yeah. That is our deputy president. I'll just be reading that in a few. I had it. I've just lost it a bit. But, that's the whole point. But despite all these things happening, like, what is the exact reason when it comes to the fans, let alone the players? I know they want to have a better life. That's why they definitely go to Europe. But why do you think the fans a few years ago, like in the late 80s and early 90s, they used to flock to the stadiums, but now they have literally neglected going to the stadiums? Like the numbers are quite astonishing, if you must say.
Mm. Well, it's hard to compete. What you're seeing, as when you watch the Premier League on television, or the best of La Liga, I think this is the best football that's ever been played. It's not just that it's good. Today's Liverpool, Real Madrid, Barcelona, this is the best football that's ever been played by the fastest, fittest, most athletic, technically accomplished players ever. I mean, I know that one can only play who's in front of you, but I do think that today's top teams would beat any team from football's history. Brazil 1970, Hungary 1953. This lot they would wipe the floor with them, today's players. And, as the experience of African football on television is a very poor comparison, not merely because of the play, but the quality of the coverage. I mean, when I was in Nigeria, SuperSport were covering the game that I was watching with two cameras. One on the sideline, one in the stands. And there has been also the state of the stadiums are not great. I mean, Africa has suffered, as I write in the book, many stadium disasters in the last 20 years. From interventions from the police, from crushes, all sorts of, terrible situations. You have violence in some places, you have poor security. And this is not attractive to people. And it's no wonder, that people then say, okay, I don't want to watch that. I mean, I, thoroughly enjoyed, the football I've seen in Africa as an outsider. I loved it. I saw Mathare United win the 2009 Kenyan League at Nagoya Sugar,
amazing.
And about kind of 6 other people. And it was, for me, it was completely otherworldly. It was fantastic. Or seeing Mountain of Fire and Miracles play at their little stadium in Agigi in Lagos. Fantastic. 3,000-4,000 people, really good football, great vibe, something really special and different and distinctive. But it seems at the moment that the average African football fan doesn't want that. They want the Premier League.
Yeah, I think it's more of the standards that the Premier League has set. So if they don't want anything short of that, I'll just have to read that before we go to the next question. I liked how you wrote, in Kenya, for example, politicians were systematically compared to Premier League clubs. William Ruto was Leicester City, that is our deputy president, who emerged from nowhere, and took the position of the big boys. Yes, while Kalonzo Musyoka, an ex-vice president whose own presidential ambitions had faded, was Manchester United, once the talk of the town, but slowly depreciating. Well defined.
Amazing that African newspapers should take Premier League metaphors for describing local politics. And by the same token, most African politicians have a Premier League club. I spent 2 days of my life going through the Twitter feeds of all of the heads of state and vice heads of state of African nations. And like nearly half have got a Premier League team. When Ian Burma, who was the president of Botswana, goes to see Botswana play in a World Cup qualifier, he's wearing a vintage Manchester United shirt. Imagine the Queen of Britain going to see England and wearing a Hearts of Oak t-shirt. Let me say, if the Queen did wear a Hearts of Oak t-shirt, that would be good with me. I would really like to see that. To see, if you switch it around, what an extraordinary thing.
Yes, and now also when we're saying African football fans, also they're obsessed with that, and with the English Premier League, we also have to talk about the players who actually, most of them want to play in Europe because of everything that's going on in Africa, because of the failure of the structures. The structures have failed them continuously, and then we have them going all the way to Europe, learning and bringing that back on board. And you highlight it in your book, bringing it back home, but they're always fought by politics, if you have to talk about it. And a good example is Didier Drogba. You saw the other day what happened in Cote d'Ivoire when he tried to go for the top seat, and I think he literally came out with one vote out of everything. And that just shows you how maybe some Africans are not ready to embrace. They get to admire this Premier League, but when you want to bring that knowledge back home, they kind of resist it. So kindly just take us through that and what exactly needs to be done to actually change those systems in Africa.
So a good example of like the dynamics of what is going on have been the rows at recent World Cups, men's World Cups, where African squads, we get the FIFA bonus. And, in the case of Ghana in 2014, the vice president actually had to fly out with a suitcase of cash to make it happen. And that's because, these players who play in Europe all the time know how football can be properly run. They're not prepared to accept the standards of the past. They are empowered, intelligent, thoughtful adults who are not going to be messed around by administrators any longer. And they've all seen their money disappear in the past. They've all heard the checks in the post and it never arrives. And it's we want cash and we're not playing if we don't. And I salute them for doing that. So there is a generation of African players who are emboldened, skilled, mature adults who know what's what. And that's what scares the administrators. So when these people want to come back to Africa and contribute to national football, they're scared of them because they don't want to play the same games. Didier Drogba doesn't need to steal any money from the Cote d'Ivoire Football Association. He is rich. He doesn't need it. George Weah, he doesn't need it. Michael Essien, these people are sorted. And they have different ideas about how football should be run. And as you know, while there are some honourable exceptions, there are very many incompetent and corrupt people in the organisation of African football, and they are scared of these people, and that's why Didier Drogba is getting no votes, because people, it's not they don't think he knows what he's doing. On the contrary, he knows exactly what he's doing, and that's what they're scared of.
Yes. Another point that is put out there is that Africa's problems need to be sought the African way. And I was reading an article about Cote d'Ivoire, and that's what they were saying. And I was like, but Didier is from Cote d'Ivoire. What do you mean? But just because he spent some time of his life in France, they think he's actually packaged. His whatever he's bringing on board is the European experience. So what do you think about that point, saying, what African problems need African solutions, or are they just hiding behind that?
I think Africa as with all regions of the world, it does need its own solutions. It's a very particular place. And I think the future of African football is not, for example, going to be trying to compete with the Premier League. You know, it's going to have to be a different route and a different kind of football and a different kind of product on offer. It's not about to be the Premier League. So I think we do need to think about more distinctive African models for playing, promoting football. On the other hand, you know, this is often code, I think, for people who are scared of people who've picked up dangerous ideas like the rule of law, which isn't to me a European or an African concept, but a universal one. So I think, you know, Africa is, you know, does need to find its own solutions. And I think Africa actually has great and distinctive strengths that would produce a different kind of football culture. You know, the NGO grassroots football world in Africa is simply extraordinary. And I imagine, you know, a future world in which that's a really big part of African football cultures, which would make it different from other places. On the other hand, there are some universals about the rule of law, about transparency, about democracy in football associations that I think do apply.
Yes, and also let's talk about, you know, Football Foundation for Africa also stands for just, you know, nurturing all the talent and encouraging that all the way from the grassroots level to the top level. And one good example, you said you're a Spurs fan, is Kenyan international who used to play for Spurs before he moved to Canada. That is Victor Wanyama. And he's a good example of moving all the way from grassroots football all the way to playing in the Premier League. So what needs to be done? I know you've done your research on Africa. What needs to be done to promote this grassroots football, and what can the administrators do differently? Because we have seen whatever they're doing now, it's not working. It's like going in circle, corruption, and we end up wasting so much talent that is on the continent.
So I think there's a lot of, you know, lots of small things rather than one big thing. I mean, I think Kenya has made real progress. The Kenyan Premier League, by separating itself from the Football Association and by making all the clubs equal partners in the enterprise, has created an environment that favours transparency because everyone's got a stake in it amongst the clubs. And I think, you know, while the Kenyan Premier League is not the English Premier League, it's stopped the rot. You know, I think the level of corruption has diminished. I think the caliber of play is slightly better. So I think, you know, organisationally, ways around the football associations need to be found. I think that, you know, it's interesting. You know, Africa needs better infrastructure. I mean, it needs better stadiums. It needs better, and above all, better grassroots facilities. I mean, as you know, there's a lot of romance about playing on, you know, sand and on streets, and that's good. But kids in Africa need some pitches to play on, right? So Africa has actually had in the last, you know, 20 years, something in the region of 70 stadiums built by the Chinese.
Yes,
which is a huge level of investment. And these stadiums have been a complete disaster, you know, because they're not built for local football. They're built for one-off, you know, grandstanding events for politicians. You know, African football does not need more stadiums with underground car parking facilities for the president. They need the sorts of small, functional, cheap stadiums that can put on decent local football, you know, for a decent local crowd and not cost $1 million a week, you know, to maintain. I mean, that's the situation in Angola, which in 2008 spent, you know, $2.5 billion building 4 stadiums, or like Gabon or Equatorial Guinea, which did the same. And it's like, but it's useless. The ones in Angola are all empty. No one can afford to use them. So I think Africa, you know, and good, let China pay for them. I've got nothing against China paying up for stadiums. But like, stop building these kinds of stadiums. You need to be building all-weather pit, you know, you need to be building pitches for kids. You need like Agigi again in Lagos, Mountain of Fire and Miracle Stadium, it's like 6,000, but it's a proper stadium right in the heart of a working class community, easy to get to on public transport and taxis. You can fill it, and then it's got atmosphere. So I think a very different approach to infrastructure. And given that the Chinese are still willing to pay up, it's like, let's Africa should be using its leverage here and saying, no, enough national stadiums, build
yes.
small, we've got enough national stadiums to last a lifetime, but we need to think small is beautiful. I mean, I think the other thing that Africa, again, would make a big difference is women's football. Is that there is so much talent, and there is so much energy, and there is so much demand for football from young girls and women, and Africa could make a huge leap without actually it being that expensive by investing time and energy and money into the women's game at all levels. And more women running football associations, and that's great. We've got the woman in Sierra Leone was one of the first women to run a football association. Fatima at FIFA is the general secretary. But let's see that across the continent. It's a very, as it is everywhere, Africa's not special here. Very, very, very dominated by men. What a change that would be, to see boards of African football associations, 50-50 men and women.
Yes. And also we'll be talking about the players, just to make sure how the players can be protected. Before we get to that, let's speak about the Africa Cup of Nations, which goes back to CAF, definitely. You've just seen the developments recently. They have to push it to 2022 because they can't host it next year in January because, COVID-19 pandemic. But when we talk about 2022, we have the World Cup in 2022. We have club football. We have, the international friendlies in between. So when you think about the African player, that will be too much at the end of the day in 2022 for most of these players. But it seems like
I think it's a great shame.
Yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's a great shame that the African Cup of Nations has been moved to June. I loved it when it was in January. What a great thing. And, the summer in much of Africa is hot. It's really hot. It's too hot.
Yeah, last year in Egypt was too hot. Yeah.
if you can't play the World Cup in the summer in Qatar, check out Equatorial Guinea in June or July.
But it's not now the climate, when it comes to Africa, it's a bit different. The reason why, they hosted it in Egypt, that is during summer last year. So for Cameroon, they had pushed it to January because during June, July, it's like literally heavy rains in Cameroon.
Sure.
Yes, and then they decided, we can't host it later on, so let's just push it an extra year. So, but you understand that also throws off the players and everyone who's involved and the stakeholders involved in football, because it seems like Africa, we do not have our staff in place. One country is hosting it this way, the other country is hosting it this way, because it had been moved to June, July. It's only Cameroon that had requested, because of the heavy rains, to take it back to January. So a bit confusing, right. But you can say these are some of the factors that actually show why fans would struggle to support African football, David.
And another thing with the African Cup of Nations, which again, I've been lucky enough to attend one and thought it was just great. I was in Tunisia in 2004. Is that, again, so many empty stadiums,
Same thing happened last year in Egypt.
No one is going. Even the home team will attract a crowd, but after that, it's painful. And it's like, why should this be? And again, part of the problem is the new stadiums that have been built. They're built 30 or 40 miles actually from the city centre. They're not built with public transport. The taxi routes don't work for them. The matatus, they're not.
Yes.
That's how people get around in Africa. It's no good. It's okay if you've got a chauffeured Mercedes, but That's 0.01%. So I think that's a real problem. And then the tickets are too expensive. You know,
Yes.
who are we kidding? People have not got a lot of money in urban Africa for the most part. Certainly not the folks who are going to make up a big crowd. So why not make the tickets cheap? And then you've got a televisual product that actually you could sell for more money. You know, it's a bit depressing sometimes watching the Cup of Nations, isn't it? You know, when there's like
Yes.
3 people in the crowd, like, and it's, I don't know, like it's Mali versus Senegal, but you know, we're in, you know, Angola and nobody shows up.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, that would make CAF really need to get their act together, you know, and make some, and, you know, really think harder about how they, you know, they can sell the product, because it's a great, what a fantastic tournament. You know, I
Yes.
really love the African and such a rich history, you know, which again, CAF is very bad at letting the world know about. You know, it's such a rich history. You know, you can tell the
I know.
history of post-independent Africa through the Cup of Nations. Where's CAF in this? Where's CAF? You know, why are they not putting together promotional materials about it? Why have they not gathered all the great archive from the past tournaments, you know, and make that available on social media and make, you know, teach the world why Africa thinks this thing is important, you know?
Yeah.
I'd love
So
to see that.
So that brings to the point of definitely sports tourism, which CAF I think have failed to take advantage of. So that, because I know so many also Africans travel, those who are able, they actually just travel to Barcelona, they travel to Madrid because of this, you know, Madrid because of Atletico and Real. So that sports tourism part, that is what also UEFA has actually invested in, something that's lacking definitely with CAF. Any notable changes, David, since Ahmad took over from Issa Hayatou?
I don't see, I mean, tragically a lot. I was never terribly convinced by the new president. I mean, Hayatou was bad. I mean, he was frankly the Walking Dead. But you know, the guys who replaced them and the coalition, it was all about, you know, it's our turn at the trough. You know, all the people who've been upset by Hayatou, all the Anglophones who'd been pushed to one side, you know, and eventually you create enough enemies that you fall. I mean, you know, Hayatou was smart, so it took over 30 years for that to happen. But I don't see amongst this new crop of administrators at CAF any reforming zeal or really any kind of new ideas. And this is not because there aren't people in African football who do have those things. I mean, I have, you know, taught many people and met many amazing figures in African football. But, you know, this is a question of politics. We need a different set of leadership in Africa, you know.
Yes,
and
true.
the lot they just did, I mean, well, I mean, as you know, they're all under an investigation anyway by FIFA.
Yeah.
If FIFA think you're a problem, like, really, you got a problem, eh? So
A huge one.
very disappointing. Very, very
Yeah.
disappointing.
So I remember Fatma Samara took over a bit, the leadership a bit at CAF a few months ago, and so many football associations were sitting waiting for this huge change to happen. And then a few months later, we hear, okay, they have handed back everything to Ahmad. So everyone was confused, like, okay, so, you know, what was the whole point? What are we doing? Investigation. So people were expecting so much. But then once again, and also Africans kind of felt let down by FIFA. Did they have a right to feel let down by FIFA because of that period?
I mean, you know, putting your hopes on FIFA is probably always going to end in disappointment, isn't it? But I think, you know, I, like a lot of people, thought, okay, good, FIFA are going to come and clear out the stables. This is good. You know, we're going to have a proper emergency committee, the way FIFA sometimes does with national football associations. You know, they're going to get rid or, you know, ease out some of the worst offenders. They're going to actively recruit, you know, new leadership. They're going to put in place a really transparent system of governance. None of this has happened, and that's the bare minimum I think we could have expected from from FIFA. So I think Africans do have a right to be disappointed. Yeah, I'm disappointed.
Yes, and also I'm just reminded of one also point there where, you know, the African FAs had to sign off their media rights to FIFA. So it will be, it will be interesting to see how that pans out, if we can actually make money from this media rights given to FIFA. David, I know we can go on and on and on and on, but let's talk about how some of the amazing remarks, this one's I have to read from my phone, some of the amazing remarks made about media houses, about your work. And I'm really glad that I think we can talk the whole night, but because we are, you know, our time is, for 49 minutes. We've been talking for 49 minutes. But I'm glad people who are watching have come to understand why I, Shon, love this book and all your work, and also all the other people, why they're obsessed with this book, because you actually tell football in a different way. First of all, it's the unifying factor, the unifying sport across the world. But at the same time, the stuff that happens behind the scenes is actually a bit sad, and especially in Africa. So just on the age of football, we have Sunday Times to say David Goldblatt is possibly the best football historian there's ever been. We have Magnificent Goldblatt is the doyen of sports historians and brings to this account his forensic and telling eye for detail. That is Mail on Sunday. Then we have Goldblatt is not merely the best football historian writing today, he's possibly the best there has ever been. How does this make you feel, David? And are there any projects you're currently working on?
Well, it makes me very pleased and proud and humbled and amazed to hear such things. In terms of new projects, I'm not going to write a big football book for a bit. I think that's probably enough from me for the moment. But I am really interested to think about climate change.
Begging. Your fans are begging, please.
They may have to wait a little bit. I'm interested in thinking about climate change. Yes. Climate change is the biggest thing happening on this planet. And it's going to have a big impact on football. It's going to have a big impact on African football. And the world of sport is not waking up fast enough to in terms of rising temperatures. I mean, it's becoming impossible to play in 20 years in some places, but also sea level rises, which are going to threaten stadiums and football pitches in coastal regions around the world. And at the same time, you know, sport as a whole, of which football is a big part, is a major contributor to climate change. I mean, I estimate, you know, global sports carbon emissions are probably about the same as Spain or Poland, you know, which is like, this is not inconsiderable. But most important of all, you know, sport is the #1 best way to speak to the most people in the world about this issue. You know, we need to make carbon zero economies, you know, the common sense of the world. And a good place to start with that would be sport. You know, because if sport is carbon zero, then a lot of folks who are not really thinking about this issue might start taking notice and thinking about it. You know, and I suppose the other thing is, I don't know about you, but football is a source of hope. You know, you hope, you know, that this season will be better than last season, that if you work hard and train, you'll be better than you were before. You know, and we know the thing I love most about football, I think, is last minute comebacks. I love a last minute comeback more than anything. You know, when Tottenham Hotspurs came back from 3-0 down to draw 3-3 against Ajax in the Champions League semi-final last year, that was one of the greatest footballing experiences of my life. That even when everything seems lost, actually you can make it happen. And like, that's how I feel we are, the human race is with climate change. We need a really serious last minute comeback. Maybe football and sport is one of the places that we can acquire the hope and the inspiration to make it happen.
Wonderful, wonderful, David. And I hope we can have actually a long conversation about the climate change and the steps needed to just make sure the whole world, especially the sporting world, can adjust to whatever is coming. So before we go to our quick fire, let's quickly take the questions. We have Peter Alegi, who will be our next guest. Yes. He says, David, do you have any suggestions for African authors who are considering writing a serious soccer book what stories would you like to read about?
I mean, I think, you know, the era of the 70s and the 80s, you know, after independence, when African domestic football, you know, gets going, and is a really significant cultural phenomena. I would love to know more about just what it was like. You know, that whole history is yet to be written. So, you know, what did Enugu Rangers mean in Biafra after the Civil War? What was the interplay of that club, you know, with its fans and with the Igbo experience? You know, and there are lots of examples of, you know, clubs in Africa who have had deep social histories and entwinements with the population. I would love to. I would love people to be doing work on that. I'd be really interested to hear more about the African sports media you know, before the digital age. I mean, now, you know, we can access it all on the internet, but how are people thinking and writing about football in Nigeria and Senegal and Angola in the 1960s and the 1970s? So those really detailed textured histories of African football before satellite television. And, you know, now's the moment to do it, because, you know, people are dying, people are getting old. So all the people with the stories in their heads, it's like, we got to get them. We got to get them now while we can. So I would really love to read more about that. I would love to read more about the role of football in colonial Africa as a source of resistance. You know, again, we have fragmentary information about, I don't know, you know, Nyerere using football clubs as a cover in Tanzania, you know, for his independence activities. I really want to read that history. And somebody needs to begin the process of writing the history of women's football. We have very scattered information in Africa. So I think that would be a very important thing to do. I'd love someone to write more about music and African football. I mean, again, one of the great features of African football that I think we're losing is you used to get the most amazing singing and music. I mean, when I went to see Asante Kotoko versus Hearts of Oak about 10 years ago, you still got the most amazing band, you know, 25 trombones and trumpets playing through the game. I would like, you know, so that history would, I think, would be really interesting. I mean, somebody needs to do the dirty work of writing the histories of the football associations and the politics of the era. And then there's all the great grassroots projects in Africa, which, you know, I mean, I've encountered a few in my time. I know there are hundreds more. I would love people to write more about that.
Yes. We have Jen Kanyi, who says you need good grassroots coaching infrastructure as well, resources, education, professional development, create careers for men and women in football. Before you just comment on that, it takes me to this. I remember we were discussing with Brian the other day. When we talk about football in Africa, most people think it's only about the men and the women who are kicking the ball on the pitch. But if you take a look at the English Premier League, and I thought Africans would be able to see this in a different perspective, that we see everyone is involved, you know, from the ball boys, from the coaches to the people behind the scenes, even the social media marketers, the digital marketers, they still have a job because of these football clubs and because of these players. But in Africa, we tend to think it's all about just the men and the women on the pitch, David.
I mean, I think Jane's question is really great. You know, I was talking about Africa needs, you know, different infrastructure, different stadiums, different pitches. But of course, none of these are any good unless you're teaching people how to play football. And I think, you know, the number one infrastructure is coaching and coaching education. I mean, Africa, you know, can perhaps take a leaf or look to somewhere like Iceland, which, you know, has gone from nowhere to extraordinary levels of international success, with still an essentially amateur football base, because where they put their energy and money above all is into coaching. So the number of coaches per head of the population in Iceland is like 5 times that of England. You know, that's extraordinary. And, you know, coaching education is a lot cheaper than building stadiums. You know, for
Yes.
the money that you build some mega stadium in Luanda, you know, you could have educated 5,000 coaches, you know, in Angola, and bought a bunch of kit and balls. So, you know, I think that's, and you know, what's Africa's, you know, great resource is Africans, is the people, you know, and the enthusiasm and the energy that is out there, and giving people coaching, education, and training as a way of mobilizing that, you know, and then it multiplies because those coaches go out into the world and make things happen. So I think that's a really, really important thing to be considering.
Yes. Another comment from Urkwe is I have been traveling to Nairobi for 7 years, supporting grassroots football, and I have never had more eloquent and knowledgeable summary of how to deal with the issues in African football. People, when I tell you, these 2 books changed my life, literally changed my life. And for me, mostly, especially The Age of Football, the first chapter about Africa. Yeah, we need to work harder. We need to work harder. And David has a whole, you know, everything here. And that's why I'm saying, David, as much as we have to wait for your next piece of work, I know it will be worth it. But those are just some of the comments we're getting, David.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much. I hope people get an opportunity to read it. You know, follow me on Twitter, send me a question, let me know what you think. I will be excited and delighted to talk to anybody in Africa who wants to talk about the future of football.
Yes, and we have Michael Owiti before we wrap up. He says, very informative with good insights. Yes, David Goldblatt. Yeah, so let's quickly do our, what is it called? Our quick fire, and then you can give us details of how anyone can reach you or how they can actually get to purchase your work because it's amazing work. So quickly, let's just start with the first question. What is your favorite team, David? Oh, you had said, oh.
Okay. My favorite team is Bristol
Africa.
Rovers.
In Africa.
Oh, in Africa. Oh, I think, you know, I think it's got to be Mathare United. Got to be.
That is for Kenya. Yes, awesome. Favorite, that is, okay, best player of all time.
Best
player of all time.
Best player of all time? Whoa, okay, so like it's hard to argue with Maradona, but you know, the longer he goes on, the more I'm wondering whether Messi is the greatest of all time.
Yeah. But you know, there's always that debate between now. This is the new they call it the new generation debate between Messi and Ronaldo, and the numbers between them. Oh my goodness, amazing, amazing numbers. Messi or Ronaldo, or you just go with Messi?
Oh, it's Messi. I mean, not that I'm against Ronaldo. You know, you know, the man's extraordinary. But I think for me, in the end, I like Messi's guile rather than Ronaldo's kind of bombast.
Yes. And which is your best African national team?
Oh, I think it's got to be the Black Stars.
Ghana.
It's got to be the Black Stars.
Not Harambee Stars? Maybe you met Harambee Stars?
You know, when the Harambee Stars are showing up at the World Cup and Africa's team will be there. In the meantime, I think, you know, carrying the flag for Pan-Africanism still, it's got to be the Black Stars.
Okay. And the last question, best African player of all time?
I've got a real soft spot for JJ Okocha. I just love watching that dude play. You know, I mean, it was you know, when he played for Bolton back in the day, that was like, wow, the world's changing. JJ Okocha is playing for Bolton. Amazing. So I think he's probably my choice.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, David Goldblatt, football historian. Very amazing work. I don't know, I think I'll have to scream this over and over again so that we are also encouraging Africans to actually just pick up these books, or even if you don't like the hard copy, there's the soft copy you can always purchase and read it. Any last words, David, before we wrap up?
Just to say thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure look forward to interacting with you all again.
Yes, your social media accounts and how they can purchase your work.
So I'm not on Facebook. I don't do Facebook. So if you want to find me on social media, I'm at David S. Goldblatt on Twitter. And that's the way to find me, at David S. Goldblatt.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. I hope we can learn, because we think it's time for Africa football to actually move forward. It's time to deal with the issues that are underneath and actually put African football on the map, because we have already discovered we have the talent. So we have to see how we can promote and help this talent. And why not through some of your knowledge that you've shared with us, which is actually deep and good knowledge. So thank you so much for joining us on the show, David Goldblatt. Have a lovely evening. Thank you for sparing your time to just be with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Have a lovely, lovely evening. Bye.